project on its 60th anniversary. And let me acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose traditional lands we meet them, their elders past and present. First, I should wish the Indonesia project a happy 60th birthday. I was actually there at the beginning. Murray wasn't around.
I was. As a child.
And it turned out I came to the ANU to do my PhD on the Japan relationship. And Indonesia project really got going. But it's good to be the year before the birth because that's where the exciting things happen. And the year before the birth, the Indonesia project really got going. And I was dragooned actually into being an Indonesia specialist in that first year. And in fact, the first academic paper I wrote was on inflation and security of Indonesia before I got into the business of going on with Japan. So it was a great thing to be at the foundation of the Indonesia project. And all the contributions made to the study of Indonesia and Australia and how fundamentally that's been important to the conduct of the relationship going over the last 60 years or so. So congratulations, Indonesia project. It's a tremendous privilege and pleasure to have Mari Pangestu and Chatib Basri here. Thanks for making the time. I know they should be right now in Jakarta meeting President Prabowo. And they decided that was an inferior pronunciation. Is how we broadcast it. Coming down and talking with us about the big issues that confront Indonesia and the region and all of us today. Indonesia, ASEAN, and the crisis really of globalisation that's described in the forum lead. So thanks very much for being with us. So Mari, as I know most of you know, was former Indonesian Trade Minister, among many other things. She's now President Prabowo's envoy for trade and multilateral cooperation. She's also a member of the Economic Advisory Council in Indonesia. And there was a former finance minister. He's also on the, actually, Mari's deputy chair, I think, and then he's on the Economic Advisory Council board. Very important positions that they hold here. And of course, most importantly of all, being proud alumni of the ANU, and they want to keep it that way. Yes. So, the global economic situation seems to go from bad to worse every day, and the uncertainties escalate, including for our region. Yesterday, they saw Trump said his deal, quote unquote, with Europe. The day after, yesterday, Macron and Germany were not quite sure about that deal. Today, it's the Indian deal, and the Indians are not quite sure about that deal. You've done some deals with Trump, really, in Indonesia. Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries have been scrambling because they're hard hit really by what's happened in this trade war so far. You know, when you think about it, they're really trade exposed. Indonesia, the ASEAN economies more broadly are very trade exposed. The impact effect of the tariffs in Indonesia and the ASEAN region is pretty large, but if it gets out of hand, it's going to be even larger, more important perhaps in the other part of the world almost, Canada and Mexico perhaps accepted. So what's Indonesia and ASEAN trying to do about this? That's the question that leads to mind, and how effective it's been. I want to sort of bore down into those issues in the conversation this afternoon. Murray, if you look at the Indonesian response, one of the things that, well, Vietnam has done, and you in Indonesia, is a bilateral deal with the United States. ASEAN has made some statements, but has yet to declare a fully formed position with the implications of the unfolding trade war with China. So, how do you see things panning out now in Indonesia in particular, but in ASEAN more broadly? And how is Indonesia coping with the impact of the uncertainties thus far and the uncertainties as they develop around the deals, not only between the United States and the Southeast Asia, kind the United States and China, the United States and Europe, and the other deals that have been done around the world?
Okay, I'm going to try to give you highlights of an answer, and then I'm sure Basri can also add to it. But I think basically, even before April 2nd, we as the National Economic Council, we had been, explaining, because our job is to give recommendations to the president on his priorities. And one of his priorities is high growth, right? 8% growth, to be specific. And so we were trying to outline the notion that if you want to have 8% growth, you can't do it without investment, right? And investment is not looking so good. Our investment climate was not looking so good because with all the comparisons, whether you use the World Bank doing a business ready survey and all these surveys, is showing that Indonesia has high cost economy and all kinds of issues with investment and trade restrictions and so on and so forth. And so the argument being, okay, if you want investment to grow, you do have to deregulate. And especially, we also use the example where there was a lot of relocation happening and they were all going to Vietnam and not so much going to Indonesia. So we had been and we were negotiating the EU-Indonesia SEPA, and one of the asks in there was import licensing, to issues around import licensing. So therefore, it's the external as well as our own domestic need. We need to deregulate. And I think that was well accepted. Even back in January, February, we were already starting this conversation. Then April 2nd happened, and it kind of reinforces the message that if we really want to respond and make sure that we can manage the global uncertainties, you do have to increase your domestic resilience. And deregulation and reforms is a key part of the response. And I think that was also once again reinforced. And I think it was in April that he, in April?
First, I think it's 7th of April.
April. You remember that I happened not to be there I couldn't come to that meeting. So he then had a big town hall with all the business people saying, we have to deregulate. And he made very strong call for deregulation. So I think that's just to describe to you, that's one element of the response to the US tariffs, as well as what's happening in the world. And now let me get to the ASEAN component. So basically, I think what the most ASEAN countries are doing are what I call a three-pronged strategy, which is also being reflected into the ASEAN economic ministers' commitments. Yeah. First is, okay, all of us we cannot negotiate as ASEAN with the US, much as we would like to. First of all, the US just wouldn't want to negotiate with us as ASEAN. So we agreed, okay, each one of us, we will negotiate bilaterally and constructively and positively. We won't retaliate. We won't increase protection ourselves, right? That was the first commitment. And within that engaging constructively and positively, we try very hard to say, remember the WTO disciplines and principles. I mean, we can go into a bit of detail in that, but basically, how do you negotiate and do all those deals, but still trying to maintain the WTO disciplines? Just to give you one of the important disciplines is that you give preferential access unless you have a free trade agreement. So is this a free trade agreement? Who knows? But we will say it is a free trade agreement or on the way to a free trade agreement. That's the only way you can justify it, that it doesn't violate your WTO discipline. More importantly, that your trading partners that you already have a preferential agreement are not going to complain to you. So why did you give the Americans this and you didn't give us this when we were negotiating? So we want this. And in fact, in our ASEAN agreement, it does say that we can't give more to other. If you give more on other agreements, you have to give it also to ASEAN, something like that. So that's just one element. There are many elements. The second prong is to reaffirm our commitment to the WTO and multilateral trade restrictions, and it did make it into the AEM statement as well as the leaders, ASEAN leaders statement in May. Okay. The third prong, important prong, is let's not be dragged by the US into the abyss, into the track that it's going to be increasing protection, fragmentation, and all that. We do deal with the US. US is only accounting for 13% of global trade. 87% is still the rest of us. The rest of us should continue what has worked for us in the past and continue to have open up with each other, open regionalism, multilateral disciplines, and increase, strengthen what is already there, ASEAN, RCEP, and all the bilateral negotiations we're doing, and even expand to further partners. So this is currently what's going on with ASEAN, and some of us are trying, and it's already in the works, if you like, to the point where the ASEAN economic ministers created an ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force, which is intended to come up with recommendations how we can strengthen, speed up ASEAN, and recognize the nexus between economics and security. So for the first time, we were asked to present in the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, and it was also well received. And so this is, I think, what's trying to happen. In my words, we need to have the agency to continue. The world is not going to go back to anything that we knew, what we knew, like in the past. It's the new normal that we all have to manage.
We'll come back to the regulation agenda in a moment, because that's a really important part of the response, I think, to the impact of the Trump tariffs. But I just want to press you a little bit on the multilateral principles and how you're going to hold on to them within an ASEAN framework. What's the scope for coordination within ASEAN, and how you bring others into confidence in that around the world? All done bilaterally, essentially, at least Indonesia and Vietnam, done by bilateral deals with the United States, which is principle fundamentally.
Yes. So, the justification for us to have the bilateral deal, I mean, I'm a multilateralist at heart, as you all know. But, sometimes we have to do what we have to do. So when we negotiate a bilateral deal, it has to have a clear purpose for us in terms of the national interest. And for us, it was very clear that if we didn't negotiate with the US, we would be hit by 32% tariff. And even though our exports to the US is only 10% of our total trade, the hardest hit sectors are garments, footwear, furniture, and fishery products, and they're all labor intensive. And they have maybe more than 50% of their exports are going to the US. So they will be hardest hit. That's the main reason why we have to negotiate bilaterally. Then how do we negotiate bilaterally that is not going to hurt our national interest and is going to be reflecting what we want to do and what we need to do anyway, right? So that's basically the principle. And as much as possible, not detract us from the multilateral disciplines. So doing a bilateral deal and giving preferential access, as I mentioned, can only be sanctioned under WTO if you have a free trade agreement. So we are pushing very hard, and I believe the other side also understands that this is on the way to having a free trade agreement, because both sides actually have to go through domestic processes if it actually becomes a free trade agreement. And on the US side, they don't actually want to ever go to Congress to agree on a trade agreement. And the same on our side. But anyway, the path is towards a free trade agreement. Second, I think there are, besides the preferential access, as we all know, these bilateral deals that the US is doing have an element of containing China. And it is coming through in the trade aspect through rules of origin, as well as also restrictions on investments. Even though at the moment in the negotiations, it's not clear at all how this is going to be.
It was pretty clear with the UK, it wasn't clear with you.
No, not at least, okay, you have to do this, you have to do that, and it's X% of this, X%. It hasn't come to that point. And this is, I think, where we hope that ASEAN can have a united position, because if there is going to be restrictions on the amount of China content in your exports, that's really going to be hurtful for our supply chains and the development of the regional network, right? And what we think should happen because of the concerns about China dominance, China concentration. Yes, we agree there should be more diversified supply chain, and that's why regional agreements are important, including RCEP, and that's why appealing beyond ASEAN to Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, that what we want is a really more diversified regional supply chain, and that is the answer to reducing. Is you cannot eliminate China content, but you can reduce and deconcentrate, and it would be beneficial both, I would say, for China as well as for the region.
Let's get back to that because that's really rather important part of Indonesia's ASEAN strategy of cooperation with other regional powers. All of this has raised uncertainties and reduced confidence everywhere in the global economy. The impact has probably not come through so starkly in many places yet, but it's in the making. How do you feel that in the Indonesian economy? Not in particular sectors, but across the economy, across the macro economy, how has all this affected Indonesia?
Well, thanks, Peter. It is very difficult to speak after Marian, especially if you were a student, a former student. So I couldn't agree more with what you said. But you mentioned about uncertainty, Peter. This is the way when economists give an answer, the situation uncertain, it means that he doesn't know the answer. Or she doesn't know the answer. So we always use the word uncertainty. But allow me to sort of like to use the analytical framework to look at this. I think, relatively speaking, Indonesia is in a better position than some Asian countries for several reasons. The first one is our export share to GDP is relatively low. We have only export share to GDP about 25%. Yeah, if you compare to Singapore, it's 180%. You can imagine if there is a negative global spillover effect to Singapore, immediately will be affected. But in our case, the impact is relatively limited. In addition to that, as Mary said, our export to US is only 10%. So if you look at the direct impact, it's probably only 2.5% of GDP. Yeah, but we are more concerned about indirect effect because with the trade war, China will be affected, and China, with the slowdown of China, commodity price will slow down. This is going to affect our export. So that will be the negative side. So, but the way I look at it, of course, this is not an ideal solution. But I think we have to look at the Indonesian's position in the relative position. I hate to say this, but I keep saying that Indonesia is probably one of the least unattractive countries in the world. Not because we are doing great, but because the other part of the world are in trouble. Yeah, so if you look at from this perspective, I can see the possibility of the relocation of the production base from China, other Asian countries to Indonesia. Why? Because I hate to say this, we enjoy maybe the trade diversion. Yeah, because the relative tariff, our tariff is slightly lower than Vietnam, than India. They got 25%, or maybe quite similar with Philippines. So there is a possibility of it, provided we do an economic regulation. So to me, the trade deal is just a sufficient condition. It's not a necessary condition. The necessary condition is economic regulation. So luckily, this analysis that allow me to make a mistake in academic, like in Latin, we call it the argumentum auctoritatis. If we borrow, some argument made by an expert, then we are right. So luckily, study conducted by Warwick here in Peterson Institute is consistent with our result that Indonesia's position is relatively better compared to other countries. And because McKibben's is a brand, yeah. So we use his model and presented to the president as well, saying that look, we are in a better position provided we do an economic deregulation. So in this perspective, Peter, I will say that yes, there is an impact to us. The World Bank made an estimate probably about the impact will be around 0.5%. So from our baseline is around 5.2 to become about 4.7. Now with the slowdown with China. Probably we are talking about one. If economists make a projection with the number, it just shows that they have the sense of humor. It will be wrong anyway. So probably, but Indonesia is going to be affected too much with this. We probably can continue to grow between, I don't know, 4.5 to around 5%. Because if you recall, even during the global financial crisis, when the global economy plummeted at that time, Indonesia managed to grow by about 4.6%. So looking from this perspective, and I can see still a room for the relocation of the investment, but with only 1% difference with Vietnam, I don't think will be very significant unless we do an economic deregulation. The good news is the president made an announcement. He would like to convert import quota into tariff, to remove the local content requirement, streamline the regulation. I think this is really the thing that that we have to pursue. That this policy will be implemented. I hope I respond to your question.
But Australia. Very sanguine about what the implications are. These first things are important, but I'll push you a bit more on this because the uncertainty feeds into the capital market, and what really does happen there, and where the capital really lands. Just to take it with you a bit, when the Liberation Day tariffs happened, there was a tremendous fall in US Treasury, some took it out and broke away, and then market covered. And the market, of course, has been pretty sanguine too since then. I wonder what your assessment of that development is more generally, and what the ultimately capital market nervousness will be on trends in the global and in the regional economy.
Well,
Are you a tuck on that essentially, like the US investors seem to be?
Well, it's very difficult to predict what Trump is going to announce or to do. But the way I look at it, I still believe that if you're talking about the medium or the longer term, this kind of policy will hit US anyway. Right? If you look at the inflation number in the US on June, the year-on-year jump from 2.4% to 2.7%. And if you look at the composition of the source of inflation, on the surface it's quite normal, but on the some goods they are sensitive to tariff. Their price increase already. So probably in 1 or 2 years time, I don't know. It's very difficult to predict. Then you can see the impact in the US economy with the higher prices gonna hit the consumers, the demand as well. So under this kind of situation, perhaps Trump will sort of like make an adjustment, or I don't know, maybe and that's one of the reasons because in the beginning he mentioned about 240% for China, and then he cut it off to 125 and then 50% with Indonesia 32 because the impact will be very significant to the US market and also the financial sector. And the other thing is, I think it's part of the bond market because once the people in the bond market reacted negatively, immediately he made a statement that he will postpone the implementation of the reciprocal tariff. I don't know why, but it seems to me that somehow the reaction of the market discipline in the US will also have an impact on its policy. And looking from the Indonesian perspective, Peter, of course, with the rising yield, with the possibility of the higher inflation in the US, it's not easy for the Fed to cut the rate. But I don't know, this is a good or bad news. There is a new development now. US T-bills is no longer a safe haven. Usually during the crisis, all the investors put in money in the US Treasury. But in this case, people put the investment into gold and the Japanese yen. So if you look at the DXY, the dollar index, is steadily declined now. So there is a room, at least for Bank Indonesia, to cut the rate. And that's also explained why in the capital market, money is flowing into Indonesia because the relative return. So it's will be affected, but as I said, I think this is manageable.
When you step back from these uncertainties, what preparation do you think you should be making in Indonesia to deal with the uncertainties you described?
First, I think, as Mary mentioned, economic deregulation is necessary. The second one, our concept is about, because we need to address this issue by launching the fiscal stimulus. Yeah, because some sectors will be affected, especially the labor intensive sectors. Yeah, so I think it is very important for the government to accelerate the economic growth by launching the fiscal stimulus. If you look at in the first quarter growth, bear with me, I'm talking with number. The government spending was experienced negative growth, minus 1.4%. So if the government could launch the fiscal stimulus into the program that immediately can be executed, somehow this can help. The second part is, if you look at on the financial sector, I'm talking about the medium and the longer term, the financial deepening is still a very important issue. This is the thing that the homework that we need to resolve. Otherwise, Indonesia is exposed to vulnerability because the budget financing will come from the external financing that at any time can leave the country. So this is probably some homework that we need to prepare.
Mario, as Dennis said, Indonesia's trade dependence ratio, the ratio of trade to GDP, a bit lower than the rest. But ASEAN's is extremely high, over 100% on average, so that's pretty big time. And the trade dependence really has focused the attention that you described on defence of the multilateral system as a major objective for the ASEAN group, even though yet you're still in the process of trying to coordinate a strategy towards that. So, what actually can ASEAN do to defend the multilateral system, except make biased statements about how important the multilateral system is? How can you mobilize not only the region, not only ASEAN itself, but the region and the world to defend the multilateral system? Is it pie in the sky?
Hopefully not. Yeah, I mean, this is also interestingly, when we were attending the foreign ministers meeting, actually PM Anwar and then also the other foreign ministers were saying, yeah, we got to stop just saying this just in ASEAN communiques, but we really have to define actions that can really demonstrate what we mean, right? Walk the talk kind of argument. So this is why it's very important for us to identify what can be done in within this year, as well as identify a roadmap for the next 2-3 years, what ASEAN can do within ASEAN, as well as RCEP, which is the plus the dialogue partners, and what we can also do as agency in the multilateral system, which is the WTO forms. I guess let me just focus on the trade side. I mean, there are also other recommendations, but on the trade side, I think just within ASEAN and dealing with the US bilateral negotiations that's affecting all of us and affecting our relationship with China, I think we have to be very clear. They use the word transshipment in a very broad definition. If it's illicit transshipment where goods are coming to us and then we relabel it and it goes to China, yes, that's illicit transshipment, which we also don't want. So it means one response that we need to do is actually very clear. We need to make sure that the issuance of our so-called certificates of origin and all the customs and all that needs to be really made, improved, and the cooperation between us improved, and also the standards and so on and so forth. So that is actually one concrete recommendation that we are making. It's very technical, but it's actually very real. It's about trade facilitation. But then when you get to the trying to define what is you don't want a restrictive rule of origin vis-a-vis a kind of whatever China content. And here's where I think the economics and the security agenda needs to come together, in the sense that I think all of us agree that we don't want illicit transshipment, we don't want dominance or concentration with a certain country. It can be not China, but it can be any country, because as we found out during COVID, this is not a secure position you want to be. So you do want to have resilient supply chain. Let's come up with our definition of a resilient supply chain that actually works for our region and identify where the regional agreements need to move. And it does lead to a lot of discussion about trade facilitation, including kind of how you calculate regional rules of origin, etc. It gets very technical, but it's actually, in my time as a trade person working on this for over 30 years, we used to discuss a lot about rules of origin. And then it didn't become important because it was not an issue. Now it's become so important again. And so we're getting all our technical brains together to come up with, we need to come up with our version of what a resilient supply chain is. And it will include Australia, it will include Japan, Korea, and China. I give you an example of what we're trying to push, which is like critical minerals. We know that's a very sensitive area for the US, and it involves dominance of China. How do you have a critical mineral supply chain that is actually more diversified than what it is now? And it can include Australia and Indonesia, for instance, because we have nickel, we have lithium. And it is going to address the green agenda and the possibilities of new opportunities within the green growth agenda. And hopefully it's more so that it's more diversified, that it can also lead to the US market. If you don't do that, what you're going to end up with is two supply chains. One that serves whatever restrictive regime the US is going to impose on us, and then the rest for the rest of the world. But that's going to be so expensive and for very costly, and it will lead to fragmentation that you don't really want, right? So in other areas besides trade, investment issues, how do you have really have investments flowing between the ASEAN countries in a better way? And really the notion of RCEP. I just want to make a plug for RCEP. Maybe those of you who are not trade people, you will not really understand the importance of RCEP. It's basically the biggest free trade agreement in the world right now. And it involves ASEAN and Australia and other parts of the region. And it's already there. So you don't have to go and make an agreement. But what you can do is, first of all, have the political implemented, but get the leaders to signal their political willingness to implement and enhance it, so that you can really get that resilient regional supply chain that is really going to help us. And I mean, just very quickly on the WTO, ASEAN can also play a role in still championing some of the issues that will continue to keep the WTO relevant and important, including the dispute settlement processes. There's this MPIA of 50-something countries. I think two or three ASEAN members. Malaysia was the most recent one to join. If all the ASEAN countries join the MPIA, which is kind of a parallel dispute settlement while WTO is waiting for the US to come back and appoint the judges and improve the rules. And then there's all the other agenda, whether plurilateral or WTO reforms that ASEAN can support and champion.
Well, I'm going to throw this conversation open to the room at the moment. So we've got a couple of microphones to help us there. But I want to ask two more questions, perhaps. First to you, Mary. You mentioned the rules of origin. China content is a large component of the export content from ASEAN countries more broadly to the United States. When you say us, are you saying ASEAN as a whole? That's on the agenda for dealing with the United States on this. Is it on the table now? Are the United States negotiating, prepared to contemplate a settlement of the kind that you have in mind, which would not discriminate against China in a way that will really disrupt the Southeast Asian economy very deeply?
Good question. I don't really have definitive answers, but certainly it is, when I say us, I mean ASEAN, because it's affecting all of us. And China has also given us warning, right? Please do not, maybe they didn't use the word please. Careful when you negotiate that you don't hurt us in the process, right? We've all been given that warning, right? and don't make us choose between the US and China. That's always been our position. We want to continue to engage with both of you, hopefully in a constructive way. So when I say us, I mean ASEAN, and it is one of the items inside our ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force to make a recommendation to the ASEAN ministers. How should we best deal with this potential rule of origin issue, as well as investment restriction issue that is going to make it restrictive, right? And we need to be proactive in coming up with what we think would be a workable definition, accommodating their concerns, right? So this is the tricky part, but hopefully maybe in a month or two, I will be able to give you some potential answers, which we would then, I mean, we are continuing to have discussions, each one of us, with the US, right? So this is why it's important to be feeding each of us who are negotiating to have the same line when we face the US.
So I have to be clear in our diplomatic support for your strategy. Yeah. You both mentioned the importance of deregulation to coming through all this comfortably and offsetting negative effects. It's easy to say. It's nationally regulation. It's nationally regulation across the ASEAN country that's required here to get out of this thing. When you think about that, here's Trump intervening in the American economy that has no respect for the market at all, no respect for international rules that protect the markets, gives license to the interests that are really powerful against deregulation. So that's the first problem. But, I don't know much about Indonesia, but I know a little bit about Indonesia, and there's some powerful interests in Indonesia that treat this agenda with a great deal of caution and suspicion, I would say. So, what's the politics of managing a deregulation agenda of the kind that you need in Indonesia or you need elsewhere in Southeast Asia to get where you want to get?
First, perhaps allow me to give a justification for deregulation. Peter, one of the reasons of why many Indonesians become religious is because they have to deal with the government. I should say, there's nothing that you can do except pray to God. It's not uncertainties, right? Many of you are familiar with this. So that's really the crux of the problem. Yeah. During the Suharto era was very corrupt, but certain the investment came to Indonesia, but not after not much after the political reform after the 90s. So my point is, this deregulation should create the certainty. That's the most important one. So if you ask me about what kind of deregulations that the government needs, the most important one is simplify the licensing. If you're talking about this import quota is only enjoyed by some group of people, I don't know, maybe politically well connected because the rent seeking activities, etc. Now the question is on how. This is a problem of us as an economist. Every time we fail to launch reform, we always blame politicians. And we said that the politician doesn't want to support us. I think we have to somehow modify our approach rather than asking politicians because they have their own objective to maximize their political support, right? So we have to speak on their own language. So rather than asking the politician, to do reform, we have to incentivize them in order to support our reform program. So you can start on something that make them popular, because that's very important. You simplify some of the regulations that immediately people feel the benefit of it. If people think, oh, that's easy under his administration, then you become more popular. Once they gain the political support, they're gonna support you. So I'm humbled by the political reality. I'm not a person who believe that we can go for the uphill battle, because if your political capital is limited, then you have to create a success story. Yeah. So for example, people will feel the benefit of it. Some products that probably not dominated by the big group of politically very well connected group, but if people feel the benefit because opening up import, for example, consumers gain for this. Yeah, with the lower tariff. You can imagine, let me give an example, sorry to mention specifically of this product. With the opening up import, many middle class Indonesia and upper class, they're very happy because they're gonna pay iPhone with a relatively cheap prices. And this will make you popular. Then this, you can use it sort of like an example as a success story. You get the political support. So there is an incentive for the politician. They move to the more complex and difficult issue. So probably this is, how to do reform and practice because we learn in my classes here at ANU, they keep saying this. If you want to do reform, do big bang. You can do it if your political capital is unlimited. But if the capital is limited, do it gradually. Start with something that's very easy, very visible, but the impact is very high. I hope I respond to your question.
Yeah, thank you, Baron. Any idea about the limitations of political capital in Indonesia?
Well, I think more or less along those lines because we're all struggling with the how to. I suppose let me just take another angle. A lot of deregulation or reforms don't happen unless you have buy-in internally from the government. And this is, the coordination issue and all that. And actually this government or this president has not unlimited political capital, but fairly high political capital. So it needs to be driven from the top more with political will if it is going to happen. And you do need, I think, we perhaps who are trying to advocate for deregulation and reforms, we also need to work with the different line ministries to also convince them of the benefit to them as a ministry or as uh, affecting their KPIs, right? And this is because otherwise you will get continued resistance from the different line ministries as well, not to talk about the vested interests outside, or maybe the vested interests are also being working together with the line ministry. So that's gets very complicated. But I think if you can get the right, let's use the word champions, because I mean, in my own experience in government, that was the only way I could pass anything. If I could identify who were the champions who I needed to have within the different ministries that need for me to need for us to need to come to a decision, then I do have to work with all the different like ministries and find the champions and then get that support because otherwise you also won't be able to do it.
I call it, Peter, the political economy of possible.
With friends. Questions from the floor, if you'd like to start. There's so many. And we're going to ask you about your law work, so do everything. Let's take two at a time.
Thank you, Ibu Mari and Bapak Chatib. I'm Sharon Sia from the ISIS User Bishop Institute, but now currently an ANU HDR student. On the RCEP, I really love what you said about the RCEP, and for many reasons, it's been so serendipitous that ASEAN actually spearheaded the RCEP. Of course, it's always mistaken that it's a China-led initiative, but it's actually ASEAN-led, and I'm glad we now have it. A few years ago, I've been hearing news about RCEP secretariat. I wonder in your view, useful to also, besides finalizing arrangements to have such a secretariat, of which I had last heard might be hosted by Cambodia. I don't know how that has gone. Whether it would be useful to have an RCEP Secretary General, a ministerial position, someone who can be an envoy to go out there to speak to the WTO, to speak to all of the RCEP partners and potential partners. I myself am an advocate of bringing new members to the RCEP, including the EU, Latin American countries, and others, so that we can expand that footprint. The second question I have, if you can indulge me, would be on Singapore. As you know, our Deputy Prime Minister has come back after 6 days. Hasn't been much to report because the Americans are not keen to talk. And then you rightly pointed out that 182% of our export to GDP ratio is there. And so we're in a very bad position. And bear in mind, we have trade surplus. We have an FTA with the US. And yet we're now stuck in this position. So any words of advice from our company, very appreciate it. How can we create this code on US negotiations on tariffs? Thank you.
With that, then take the next question next month.
Oh, directly, okay. On the RCEP, actually, there's now a regional policy unit, is that what it's called? RSU. RCEP Policy Support Unit, already agreed on, in Jakarta, it's sitting in, physically in the ASEAN Secretariat, but not managed by the ASEAN Secretariat, just sits physically in the ASEAN Secretariat. And they are supposed to be discussing whether there is going to be a permanent secretariat. And that is a discussion with the Indonesian government, because you have to go through all this process. And I mean, we are advocating that there should be a secretariat. It's different from CPTPP, which doesn't have a secretariat. And we think a secretariat is needed because you do need, it doesn't have to be big to begin with. You need a lot of perhaps work, right? That is not just being done by the different members. You need a unit that's able to come up with the recommendations and help monitor the implementation. Because right now,
Organization structure demands regular meetings of the officials
right,
and ministers and so on. It
Yes.
demands the service.
that's right, yeah. Yeah, the CPPT doesn't really have regular meetings here, because we actually have regular ministerial meetings, as well as now we hope leaders meeting. Yeah, so you do need that support, and it needs to be, at the moment it's rather junior person who's managing the support unit. You need to elevate that up more. And I don't know whether you want to have a secretary general or not, but that's kind of maybe somewhere down the line. But and your point about China-led is very accurate. It's always misquoted in the media as a China-led, and it was always compared with TPPP, which was US-led.
Environment stuff.
Obama, yes. It is ASEAN-led, and this is where, again, another call for ASEAN to really reassert its leadership position within RCEP. I'm not sure I can comment too much on the Singapore position. You may add, you just came from Singapore. But I think, Singapore has a high export to GDP ratio, but its dependence on the US is, at least on the trade side, is not it's not dependent as the other ASEAN countries. You're, in fact, as you said, US has a surplus with Singapore. So you're getting the 10%, and hopefully that doesn't change. Who knows? At the moment, surplus countries are getting 10%, but who knows what will happen. But I think the positioning for us, which is important, is how, as we deal with the US, that's us dealing with the US. It should be separated from how we should be doing what's important for us. The rest, I mean, for us to continue to do our development, which is the ASEAN agenda, our domestic resilience agenda, is actually more in what we need to get right together as ASEAN, right? It's not about ASEAN positioning against the US. Each of us have different complexities in our relationship with the US. The only principle that we should try to hold as we deal with the US is not to hurt, not to have a beggar thy neighbor kind of approach, where it shouldn't hurt, what we do shouldn't hurt others as we are doing it, and as much as possible adhere to the multilateral principles.
Any advice for Singapore?
I don't want to lecture Singaporean on how to manage the situation, but I was lucky enough because the day before yesterday, I was in Singapore and got a chance to listen to your Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, in the conference for the 60 years of his independence of Singapore. So it was a sort of like discussion with Rafi Menon, Danik Wah, and one of the issues that we discussed is about how to mitigate this issue. So I couldn't agree more with Mary. I think somehow in the case of Singapore, you are quite lucky because your export is relatively diversified. So to make my life easier, let me quote what Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said. He said that Singapore will try to continue to diversify the export and looking for possibility of the African countries, Middle East to minimize the risk. But in fact, if you look at your second quarter GDP, it's pretty good. you grew by about 4.3%. Yeah, for Singapore, well, if you're talking about country like Singapore, if you under this kind of situation, your export to GDP is 182%, you still grow by about 4.3, whereas Indonesia is 25% with about 4.8. It's not bad at all nowadays. The second issue is, I think, you've got the US and a trade surplus with Singapore, correct me if I'm wrong, right? So you got this 10%. And this is the thing that, as I learned from ANU that, and I'm a big fan of the multilateralism, but this is the risk of the trade diversion is there, right? I spoke to Jacqueline Po, EDB, the head of the EDB, and she told me that more order to Singapore and also relocation of the investment come from China to Singapore. So somehow Singapore is benefited by this kind of situation. And Mary, and Peter, this is the thing that I'm concerned about. My concern is with this risk of the trade diversion, there will be a prisoner's dilemma. We know the best payoff matrix will be a cooperation, but each economic agent will focus on their own self-interest. Yeah, because if they can get the tariff slightly lower than other countries, then they will get. So the issue of this ASEAN to cooperate together, there is not much incentive on that. And that will be very dangerous because that's the game that US is playing with all other countries. They don't want to deal, through the multilateral or the bilateral free trade agreement. They want to have the deal bilaterally. And with this prisoners dilemma possibility, it will be very difficult to make this coordination. I hope I'm wrong here.
The bilateral issues to Singapore, particularly with the United States, is not the important thing for Lawrence Wong. You said very often it's the system the world falls is that important. But Singapore and the rest of us too. So we should talk a bit more about that, but we have another question. Yep. First.
Hi, I'm Lily. I'm a postgrad student here. If the case to reform is making it attractive to the middle class, how do we expand the appeal so it also reaches lower income groups who often don't have the same access or visibility to the benefits? Thank you.
So you want to ask about the lower middle
Class. Inclusiveness, yeah. How to make deregulation inclusive? Is that the question? Yes.
That's not first one. You want me to?
You want to take more questions or?
Don't know.
Okay, let me start.
We might have to-
This is very interesting. There is a study conducted by World Bank and LPA. Yeah, one of the reasons Hal wrote a piece on this, he called it correct me if I'm wrong, follow me on if I'm not mistaken. So most of the structure of industry in Asia is basically the small one or the very big one. Many, not much in the middle. Maybe one of the reasons behind it is because the cost of doing business is relatively high. If you are small, then you cannot afford to do it. So if you are in a middle size, you cannot afford to do it. So it is very important. So maybe the best way for you, just to continue to be a small and the informal. And then if we do the economic deregulation, you remove the licensing, you improve the process, which is one thing that government already loves. The PP5 is become the PP28, within which then if you apply on something that within certain period of time, if I'm not mistaken, 30 days,
Yeah.
and there is no response from the government, then your application will be automatically. So this kind of policy, I think that will be very useful, especially for the small medium enterprise if they want to do business. So I do believe that that kind of economic deregulation is useful. Let me give the other example. I'm talking about the textile market. Yeah, they are the price taker, right? Because you are not a big player. If you got a problem on the high cost economy, you cannot pass on this burden to the consumer because they will buy from other countries. But if you are a natural resources, you are a price setter, you can pass on the burden. So the natural resources sector, they can afford to pay the primary, but not the garment, textile, and the small medium enterprise. So if we do an economic deregulation, somehow you will help this lower middle income group for the business.
There's one question up the back there.
Hello, my name is Marco. I'm an associate professor from China's National University. Currently, I'm the visiting fellow next door China Center. So I'm very interested in Mary has mentioned that the green growth between China and ASEAN, particularly with the EVs, because Indonesia is rich in resource. Actually, I just wrote a paper on these issues in Chinese. I'm working on English one. But your point is very interesting because you say Indonesia wants to extend the supply chain to New Zealand and possibly Australia as well. But I think for the Chinese, we felt Americans building an alternative supply chain to exclude China, particularly with New Zealand, Australia, and some of the resource-rich ASEAN countries. So it seems that that's quite contradictory. So I'm really interested with your opinion on if you have a dialogue with New Zealand, Australia, what will the response? What will you choose? If the American come to you and say, build a supply chain with us, then it's full time. Thank you.
I think because of the IRA back in Biden's IRA was 3 years ago, there was already this notion of containing China, including companies with Chinese ownership being limited to 25%. So actually, there have been a lot of discussions there. How do we diversify our supply chain if our intention is to enjoy the subsidy in the US? The subsidy is gone now, by the way. But anyway, this discussion shows you that even the Chinese companies are also responding in Indonesia by diversifying their ownership also, so we are seeing responses and also increased investments, trying to have investments from other countries. Like the example for Indonesia is Vale, which is Brazilian-owned company, which has nickel, and they produce green nickel. And they have cooperation with Ford to supply the precursor that will go to the batteries for the EVs in the US. It was in response to the IRA. So I think not everything will be developed to eliminate the role of China, because for the rest, it doesn't matter as long as you're not trying to get to the US market or enjoy the subsidy in the US. So I think what will happen.
Only if that's not limited by the direction that US policy takes, and that's part of the plan.
Yeah, right. And even the US, I think, recognizes you can't eliminate. Yeah, it's more about containing. So it's whatever. It is more about, for us, having more diversified supply chain, right? And I think China also, it also means more Chinese investments, yes, but also when Chinese invest, they shouldn't just be 100% Chinese, right? They should also have partners. And then also in terms of the critical minerals element, there are obviously other sources besides China and Indonesia. It should include Australia, which has lithium and others. And there were talks already in place trying to do that. I do think green growth agenda, whatever happens with the US and climate change and Paris, is a very important agenda for Indonesia and for the region, and it should provide new opportunities of growth. And it cannot be done without China in there. China has the lowest and most efficient technologies on the renewable energy as well as on electric vehicles.
More questions? Lots more questions. Yeah. Sir.
Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. I want to ask a question more relevant to the National Economic Council, perhaps, rather than the international trade. And that is, in Indonesia, looking back over the 60 years of the Indonesia project, we've seen an incredible improvement in statistical systems. We've gone from a non-census in 1961 to a very successful census in 1980, 90, and so on. Recently, we had the collapse of the census in COVID. And we've also found, as in the United States, that when government budgets had to take cuts, often databases were lost. And we found in the US with cuts to the NIH and other agencies, we've seen great losses in databases. In Indonesia, with the creation of BRIN and the shutting down of the various Puslistan, we've seen databases have gotten either erased or gone shaky. I'm wondering whether it's a priority of the National Economic Council to make the case for better data, because all the wonderful statistics you've been citing have numerators and denominators, and if the numerators or the denominators are not valid, then the statistic is not going to be very convincing.
Yeah.
You want to take the three questions and then answer?
So mine's a different question.
Well, Terry, I couldn't agree more with you. The thing is now, we at the National Economic Council, we propose about the program what we call the GovTech, the government technology. So one of the pilot project that we are working on now is on the social protection in Banyuwangi, right? So on this project like social economic protection, social protection, we have to make sure that the data is correct, inaccurate. Otherwise, there will be an implication because the problem with the targeting is about 50% is mistargeted, right? So we work closely with the BPS now, not only with BPS, but also with Bank Indonesia, with a payment ID, with other, and then we organize what we call the DTSN. So the DTSN, data terpadu.
Data terpadu nasional.
So there's something like
Integrated
integrated
data, integrated one
So
national data.
we are working
National one data.
yeah, national one data. It's not perfect, but we work on it because the incentive for us, for the government is if they can allocate or targeted this social protection program correctly, at least the government can save the money about 50%. So you're talking about 500 trillion, 50% of it, 250 trillion. So there is an incentive for the government to make sure that this is accurate. But of course, the list is there about this data because the budget cut, etc. So probably we have to continue to monitor and to make sure that the concern about the data, because all the policy recommendation produced by the National Economic Council is really an evidence-based data. Yeah. So if the data is not there, we cannot provide the recommendation. I hope I respond to your question.
How?
So thanks for a wonderful seminar by Indonesia's two leading economists. Question is, more than half of intra-ASEAN trade and more than half of intra-East Asian trade is in the things we call global production networks. Our colleague Chandra Corolla isn't here or anything, so it's a question he'd ask. Andrew Acho could also ask it. So more than half of the trade is this, these things. And it's through a thing called the Information Technology Agreement, as you know. It seems to me it's almost possible to unpick those kind of transactions. These are highly efficient sort of industrial organization forms. And let's talk about two supply chains. It's never going to happen, is it? It can't happen because the cost of trying to unpick them, when you've got components coming from 5 countries going to another 5 countries, and it's all free trade because it has to be to make these global production networks operate under this ITA, then it's just impossible to imagine how those things can be unpicked, isn't it? And we haven't seen enough evidence to know what's happening yet, have we? Because all the Trump rubbish is just erupting, but it's hard to imagine it really happening. Maybe at the margin, but when we're dealing with more than half of the trade, I can't see it happening. What do you think?
Good question, but we're still working through the answer. I'm actually part of the geoeconomics task force. We're actually looking quite deeply into this question. And so far, looking at the numbers, you're absolutely right. It's very hard to dismantle the supply chain that's already existing. It's so integrated and it's like going in here like that, right? So it's exactly what US is facing when they ban Mexico and Canada on the autos, for instance. And we looked at the numbers to see that the most integrated supply chain is actually in semiconductors, electronic components. Yes, all those things, right? And to some extent, critical minerals. Yeah, critical minerals. And it's going to be very hard to dismantle, right? And we looked at the investment numbers. Interestingly enough, there's this database that is very expensive to subscribe to, apparently, compiled by the Financial Times. What they do is they look at announcements of investment decisions in the newspaper, and then they compile it very, disaggregated, granular way. And guess what? Investments into ASEAN, including the US, is still going up, even up to May. February to May, it went up. And the US is the largest investor, so this is like intentions, and they're not just saying, oh, we're gonna plan. This is announcements, we are going to invest, right? So US is 25%, if I'm not mistaken, of the investments coming into ASEAN. And then we did some preliminary interviews to talk to buyers and suppliers. And we think it's going to end up where they are not going to dismantle, they can't dismantle the supply chain. It's just going to be more expensive. And it's the US consumers who are going to pay for it. So they're just going to swallow the tariff or whatever. And I don't know how they're going to get around the restrictions if they're going to have China containment issues in there. That's something that we don't know yet. This is the uncertainty, right? And they are also advocating, please don't succumb to restrictive tariff margins. So they would also hopefully be important advocates for us in the US market. But at the end of the day, that whatever costs, it will come at a higher cost to supply to the US because of the just looking at the tariffs alone. So it's the US consumers that's going to pay. But for the rest of us, I believe it's the supply chain and the global value chain is going to be continuing. But what we want to do is make it more diversified regionally.
Thank you. My question is part economic, part economic geography. Thank you, Bob. We're really drilling down deep here, and I think this is fascinating. Let me pose the question this way. It's always hard to know in the present time whether we are, this is a big bump in the road, something like COVID, and we are still going to find the course there, something like the past, or is this now a conjuncture where the future is going to start to look rather different, and it will look more different with each passing year? Now, the background to that is to say that in the 1980s and 90s, Southeast Asia got a huge boost, all those tigers and so on, from the offshoring of manufacturing, particularly from Japan and Taiwan and Korea. We know Korea himself has been writing much about that. Much of that investment, those factories are now quite dated. That's 40, 50 years ago. Now, we're preoccupied at the moment with the US market, but surely, and Mike has touched on this, we must also be thinking, what will the structural change be in the Chinese economy over the next generation? And it does seem fairly likely, with rising real wage costs, that China will be looking to offshore more and more production, not because of anything happening in the US, but simply because of the economics of it. And we're also, I think, fairly confident that the Chinese will need to boost consumption within their own country. So these two factors do tend to work together. Now, then let me bring in the economic geography. Ever since the 1980s, the difficulty in Indonesia has been to find real effective exchange rate that will balance the need to absorb labor in Java against the need also to develop resource exports from the islands. And this is still true, that there is this difficulty of balancing economic development across the country. So I'm trying in my head to think of these two things, to see the future from something like 2040, where China has been addressing the problem of how to maintain its own growth and boost its own prosperity. And at the same time, the difficulty for Indonesia and ASEAN of piggybacking on this and the potential of this, which it does include, as Maria has just said, of course, the green revolution technology as well. So it's a kind of 2040 question with an economic geography component. I hope that's clear, but maybe it isn't.
Something
Thank you.
to say.
Well, this is a very tough question, Howard, for this. The first one is, if you're talking about China, yeah. One thing that if you're talking about the longer term issue, the other factor that I think we have to put into account is the demographic transition. Yeah, I believe Lisa gave our lecture a couple of days ago. Because in the case if you look at among ASEAN countries, only Indonesia and Philippines have the so-called the young population. But this will peak in 2045, if I'm not mistaken. So if you look at from this perspective, the productivity will continue to decline on some ASEAN countries, regardless what happened the other part of the world. And Indonesia will start to enter the aging population by 2050. Yeah, if we continue to grow by 5%, there is a risk for us, it's too old to get rich. That is why the acceleration of economic growth. So regardless the China model, my point is somehow we probably cannot repeat the recipe like what we had back on the 90s because the global situation is very different now. Yeah, I'm not sure about Trump policies. Maybe this Trump reciprocal tariff will stay about 3 to 4 years, but beyond that, but it's hard for me to imagine that the globalization like in the 90s will happen again. In the 90s, the globalization was perceived as the source of the prosperity. Now, many people perceive that the globalization is the source of conflict. If you're dependent too much, then you'll be vulnerable. Yeah. So under this kind of situation, this is I don't have the answer for this, but the strategy is probably will be how to entangle the economic efficiency with the economic security. And that's probably, I hope I respond to your question. I'm not sure.
Mara, you share that?
Let me just add that if you're asking what the world, you say, is this are we at a crossroads? Are we going to see something that's different in the new normal? I would say yes. Just to add to what Dede said, I think U.S.-China rivalry and tensions are going to continue, and I don't know what is the end game. And multilateral, the U.S. as the champion for multilateral anything, not just the trade system, but just multilateralism, is no longer there. Therefore, the rest of us, it's not a bit. It's up to the rest of us to really maintain what we think should be maintained, because you can't reinvent the Bretton Woods. You want it, but you do have to reform or make the Bretton Woods more relevant, blah blah blah, right? So how do we play an agency role there? We meaning we who are caring for this to take place, because it will help us to continue to develop. And then China, demographics, domestic demand. So if US is going to be less and less an important market, hopefully China becomes more and more an important market, not just as someone who's going to be trading and investing, but as a market, right? And I think that requires many things to happen in China as well. And on your question about Indonesia, it's always the commodity boom. We always the lucky country, a bit like Australia. we seem to be rescued every time by commodity boom, including in 2022. And every time then things get bad, we ask the question again, how do we diversify our economy? You know, I think this is a perennial question, but hopefully this time round we take it seriously.
This time is different.
Hopefully, and there's enough, maybe the uncertainty in the world and the crisis that we are facing, hopefully will get us back on track on, you know, having a more sustainable diversification strategy.
So I was going to ask Warwick about the update on his model, but he escaped. And just saying that he does a new set of results every day.
Yes, that's right.
So you should look at the last set of results maybe before you answer. So let me just say what a wonderful privilege it has been to have you both here. But now you're here in Australia, now you're here in Canberra, we should use the opportunity to get your advice. You've told us a lot about what Indonesia is doing or trying to do, a lot about what ASEAN is trying to do and how it's trying to do. What should Australia do? There are a lot of people here in Australia who think, like you, that right, everything's under control, she'll be right. And it's the top tariff effect, because it's not directly so impactful on Australia, because the limited group of countries are affected directly in the US trade for Australia. Steel and aluminium and pharmaceuticals are problems, but it's a pretty limited effect directly. But here's Trump tearing down the whole trading system and turning over agreements and rules that have been in place for 70 or 80 years. And that doesn't just mean you've got to consider the direct effects on Australia. It's not like the China coercion problem where they banned a few exports, some critical exports, a few exports. They didn't tear down the whole system like Trump is doing. So I wonder, you know, in that context, really, what advice you would give to Australia about what it needs to do, not only by itself, but for the region, in conjunction with what you're doing, and particularly with Indonesia, to position in response to the uncertainty. Right.
Let me start first, because I believe Mary has the answer, because she used to live here longer than so she could like advise. I think, Peter, this is really the time for Australia to work closely with ASEAN. I do believe with this, you know, with the geo-fragmentation with China, the rivalry between US and China. I think it's very important for Australia to work closer with ASEAN countries. So let me talk specifically in the case of Indonesia. Yeah. We probably talk about this, you know, to enhance cooperation. But if you look at the investment from Australia to Indonesia, steadily decline, actually. So we need to sort of like to encourage. The question is, this is the thing. Let me come back about the issue of the political economy, and let me propose this idea again. I had a discussion with Mary this morning. Indonesia always concerned about the issue of the what we call the self-sufficiency, especially related to agriculture product, the dairy product, beef, etc. So one way to do it is we should define self-sufficiency not locally produced but locally owned. So I think it's about time for Indonesia now to start to invest in Australia, maybe in cattle, you know, some beef, and then be opening up the trade regime in Indonesia. So Indonesia and Australia will be part of the supply chain, regional supply chain. We can do the same about this critical mineral because you have lithium. Yeah, this is just an example, but probably a couple of things that Australia can also work with other ASEAN countries. So I do believe that we cannot continue to rely too much with the US at this moment because a lot of uncertainties. So diversification, closer cooperation for any countries besides the United States, I think that's very important. I hope I respond to your question.
No.
Let me give a kind of more broader strategic answer to your question, Peter, because it's something that we've been thinking a lot about. I think it's one thing to think about what the direct impact, as you're saying, from the US. And maybe because Australia is not like Indonesia or Vietnam having big impact. you sort of, oh yeah, don't worry too much about it. But you can't just look at the US impact. The US, whatever the US is doing, has all kinds of secondary impacts on the multilateral system, on the second round effect. If you ended up having a trade war, if everybody increased their protection, and we have scenarios, as you know, IABR with ANU, CSIS are cooperating also on the modeling. And it shows very clearly that the direct impact, if it's there's the direct impact, and then there's the second round impact of a trade war and everything. And that's going to be so negative for ASEAN, for Australia, for the rest of the world, and even for the US and China itself. And what do you need to do? You need to protect what has worked for us together, right? Which is the open regionalism, which is continuing to trade and invest with each other. So Australia needs to play part of that agency role together with ASEAN. And clearly, the RCEP is the most immediate implementable agenda out there. Because it is going to lead us to a really diversified region where we are being more and more integrated. And it's not just the trade side. It's also the investment side, it's the people-to-people movement and services. There's so much opportunity there that I would hope that Australia would rise to the occasion and join us in the call for having a clear signal to support an RCEP leader summit, which has been proposed by Prime Minister Anwar. Because I think that would be clearly a signaling. We're not doing this to be against the US. We're doing this because it's important for us to get everything else right that's in the world that will continue to make us grow and develop.
Well, thank you both very much for the tremendously helpful sharing ideas about what ASEAN, Indonesia, ASEAN are doing in Canada. Thank you for being with us where we should be in Jakarta. And please join me in David Nunley.
Former student, can I ask you a question? Did we pass the exams?
Getting there.